Good morning, everyone. I'm Tomiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute and Chair of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this convening, telling the truth about all of this, about slavery and its legacies in higher education. The conference title is taken from Black Reconstruction in America, the path-breaking work by W.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard. Du Bois wrote, "Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this?" Writing in the era of segregation, Du Bois captured America's troubled racial history, marked first by slavery, and then by equal citizenship rights promised but denied. Yet he also provided a vision for a more just future, in part through fearless pursuit of the truth, even when it's painful. His words, written nearly 90 years ago, remain powerful and relevant still today. In this fraught historical moment, profound racial injustice has been laid bare, demanding urgent remedy. Yet these challenges are long-standing and deeply rooted in history. As I've often said over the course of Harvard's reckoning with its legacies with slavery, we can't dismantle what we do not understand, and we can't understand contemporary injustice unless we reckon with our history. And we're doing just that at Harvard. As many of you will be aware, earlier this week, Harvard released a report on the university's entanglements with slavery and its lingering effects, as well as recommendations for action that our president and the Harvard Corporation accepted and allocated unprecedented resources to implement. Now, the report not only documents the history of slavery, but also the leadership and the excellence of Harvard's trailblazing Black students, despite the unwelcoming environment they often encountered on campus and, of course, beyond. When W.B. Du Bois first stepped through Harvard's gates in 1888, he entered an institution that, notwithstanding its well-known abolitionists and racial reformers, in fact had a history of direct financial and intellectual ties to slavery and the ideologies that justified continuing racial oppression. And the vestiges lingered. Reflecting years later on his experience of marginalization, Du Bois said, "I was in Harvard, but not of it." Nevertheless, he embodies a proud history of African-American resistance at Harvard. Du Bois would go on to co-found the Niagara Movement, which became the NAACP, the nation's oldest civil rights organization. And in his scholarship and public life, he upended prevailing notions about slavery and challenged racist ideas propagated by some Harvard faculty and presidents. He was an engaged alumnus, and he called Harvard to account for its discriminatory housing and admissions policies. Du Bois and those who followed him at Harvard and Radcliffe, people like William Monroe Trotter, Charles Hamilton Houston, Eva Beatrice Dykes, and Carolyn Bonday, made invaluable contributions to this nation. Through their intellect and their activism, these alumni helped remake America into a more perfect union. And in their experiences, we see the intertwined histories of discrimination and Black resistance within and beyond institutions of higher education. Telling the truth about all of this means telling these stories in all of their complexity. It means telling the true story of this institution that we so appreciate today, despite the bitter and painful parts. And ultimately, it means telling a more complete history of our nation and of our world. Now, Harvard is neither alone or the first in its efforts to reckon with the institution's history with slavery and its legacies. Indeed, over the past 20 years, universities north and south and around the globe have begun undertaking this work, uncovering long ignored ties to slavery. As these histories come to light, we have an opportunity and a responsibility to shape a better future. At our conference today, we pose the question, what now? What must institutions of higher education, and indeed all institutions, do to reckon with their histories? How should we approach the vital work of addressing past harms and enduring legacies? Now I want to give you a brief overview of the day ahead. In just a moment, I'll introduce Harvard University President Larry Bacow. After Larry's remarks, we'll hear a poetry reading by Tracy K. Smith, who is professor of English and of African and African American Studies in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Suzannah S. and Kenneth L. Wallach professor here at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Then our first panel of the day will explore universities and their roles in repair of legacies of slavery. Our morning session will conclude with a keynote address by Prairie View A&M University President Ruth J. Simmons, who will be introduced by Harvard University Provost Alan Garber. Ruth will be joined in conversation by my distinguished colleague, Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. We'll then break for lunch, during which you'll have the opportunity to participate in a ceremony of remembrance and reflection. When we reconvene for our afternoon session, we'll examine legacies of slavery in spaces where people learn and explore, including libraries and museums. Our third panel of the day will focus on innovative approaches to public engagement with history, and then a roundtable discussion will explore global perspectives on reckoning and repair. Finally, Professor Ibram X. Kendi will deliver our afternoon keynote. We welcome your questions throughout the program, whether you're watching in person or online, here in person or online. You can submit questions using Slido, a link that should be behind me on the screen, and is also posted in the chat feature on Zoom. As we transition to our program, I want to sincerely thank all of our speakers and moderators for joining us today. Let me also express profound gratitude to all of the members of the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and Legacy of Slavery, the faculty committee, to the dedicated staff, and to the many members of the Harvard community whose time, energy, and expertise enabled us to undertake this work. It has been an honor to lead this effort. And I want to thank everyone at Radcliffe, and there are so many of you who contributed to our ability to do this work. Thank you so much. Special thanks as well to all of the students who contributed to our work. In fact, I want to invite those of you who are on campus to visit Harvard Yard to view a student art installation called Inclusions. This project, which was supported by the initiative in partnership with the Harvard Office of the Arts, is just one example of the creative and scholarly work that students brought to this effort. And finally, I want to thank everyone who is joining us virtually or in person today. With that, I'm pleased to give the floor to Harvard University President Larry Bacow. Larry is the 29th president of Harvard, and he launched the Presidential Initiative on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery in 2019. Larry, thank you for your commitment to truth and meaningful change. Please join me in welcoming President Bacow to the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Tomiko. I want to begin not only by welcoming all of you who are here in person and also virtually, but also by expressing my gratitude, and not just mine, but the corporation's gratitude to you, Tomiko, for leading this effort, and to the members of the Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. It was hard work, but it's an extraordinary gift that you have given to this institution. You've created a report, I think, of profound consequence to the university, and sparing literally no effort during what was, let's face it, a very, very difficult time, a global pandemic, when it was hard for you to come together and meet. It was hard for you to get to the people that you wanted to talk to. It was hard in some cases to access the sources that you wanted to use. But you persevered. And I think your resilience and relentlessness really epitomizes your commitment to this important work, your commitment to each other, but also your commitment to the institution and to our highest ideals. So thank you for these efforts. I want to also thank the other people, though, who played a role in setting this all in motion, who gave careful attention to Harvard's entanglements with slavery and set us on a course to a fuller reckoning. And this begins, at least at Harvard, with work of some of our colleagues, Sven, thank you, but also with my predecessor, with Drew Faust, an extraordinary scholar in her own right, but also an equally extraordinary human being who convened the initial committee to ask a set of questions which launched us on this path. And I'm indebted to Drew for so many things, as we all are, but I also have to note with pride, she was, like Tomiko, also the head of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, the founding director, so all roads sort of lead to Radcliffe. Finally, I want to thank my longtime friend and colleague, Ruth Simmons, we'll hear from in a few minutes. Ruth had the courage to act before any of the rest of us did. When she was president of Brown, she asked a series of very hard and difficult questions at a time in which it was not fashionable to do so. And in doing so, she really paved the path for many of the rest of us. I'm sorry that it took some of us as long as it has, Ruth, to follow the road that you identified for all of us. But now we are here, and we've begun the work that really you started. We are all indebted to you. Thank you, Ruth. Please join me. Since the Tuesday release of the committee's report, and my phone is blown up, you know, I've received hundreds and hundreds of messages from all sorts of people who felt that they needed to share their thoughts. And, you know, I've heard from students, I've heard from faculty, I've heard from alumni, I've heard from parents, I've heard from neighbors, I've heard from friends. In general, the reactions, I'm very, very pleased to say, have been positive. I think that a deeper understanding of Harvard is welcome. People are interested in our history, even if the cost of that understanding is difficult, is painful, and even if it at times provokes anger. I think honesty, long delayed, is always welcome. And I think humanity, though long delayed, is welcomed even more so. And in this report, we see a true expression of humanity. Now, I would be less than candid if I didn't tell you that other reactions have been far less generous. I know that will come as a great surprise to this group. Some have been sobering reminders of the times that we live in, of another one of the lasting legacies of slavery, and how they continue to stain our national life, our national conversation. Yet they too have value, because they underscore the importance of the work that we have set out for ourselves. Because echoes of slavery still live and are still reverberating in the minds and hearts of many. Then there's the group that's in between, people who were neither positive nor negative, but people who ask questions of us, questions which I think actually are deserving of thoughtful, considered answers. Why did we choose to focus on these issues, at this moment in time, when we are confronted by so many other pressing issues? And I think it's important that we answer these questions and that we continue to answer them as they are asked. My hope is that our efforts here at Harvard will be viewed as a public good, creating opportunities for action that extend far beyond our own campus and the recommendations that we will now work to implement. I think getting to that point will require reiteration of the rigor of history, of the value of history, because as Tomiko has so eloquently stated, and I stole your words in the message which I sent to the entire 400,000 Harvard members of the Harvard community, we cannot hope to build a better future until we first reckon with our past. Now, with nearly 400 years behind us, we could be, and in some cases have been, seduced by, let's face it, a rosy view of our own history, a highly selective view of our own history when we've done it. You know, where a view of our history where we tend to privilege sort of virtue that makes us feel good about who we are and what we've done and what people who've come before us have done. And I have to confess that I've been guilty of this myself at times. I have the privilege of living in the president's house at Harvard, known as Elmwood, which is in fact featured in this report. And so if you've read the report, you know something of Elmwood's history. And when I talk to visitors to the house about where we live, you know, I'm fond of noting that it was commandeered by George Washington during the Revolutionary War, turned it into a military hospital to treat the wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill, Breeds Hill. I talk about the fact that Elbridge Gerry lived in this house, governor of Massachusetts, signer of the Declaration of Independence, vice president of the United States, and the guy who gave us gerrymandering. You know, not everybody's perfect. I'm less inclined, although I do it, to talk about the fact that the house was built by Thomas Oliver, the colonial lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, King George's representative in the colony, who made his money in sugar plantations in Antigua and had 12 slaves who worked, 12 enslaved people who worked at Elmwood. It's, I think, easy for all of us to view history through a highly polarized lens. When we do that, though, we fail to live up to our commitment to truth, to our commitment to veritas. Now, all of us at Harvard, all of us are heirs to all that Harvard is. And we cannot claim to stand for truth if we limit our view of that past. And let me just repeat as we get started here today that the truth is that enslaved people worked on our campus, that the labor of enslaved people enriched donors and ultimately this institution, that members of our faculty promoted ideas that gave scholarly legitimacy to concepts of racial superiority, and that this university, where we all sit today, this university, which prides itself as being among the very best in the world, continued discriminatory practices long after the 13th Amendment eliminated slavery in the United States in 1865. The reality is that slavery played a significant role in our institutional history. That this truth has been obscured for so long should prompt our indignation, and it does, but more importantly, it must also prompt our action. That's our responsibility at this point, and we take that on now seriously and willingly. Slavery and its legacy included the persistence of both subtle and overt discrimination that continues to influence this nation and the world in the form of disparities in wealth, income, social mobility, education, access to justice, access to housing, and virtually every metric that one might choose to measure and assess equality. Every single metric. As we look back, no one, I would hope, would conclude that Harvard is solely responsible for where this nation finds itself at the moment, or maybe even primarily responsible. But I believe, because of our past, we bear a moral responsibility to act. This is our responsibility to try and shape a better future, to respond to practices which, candidly, we helped to perpetuate, as this report so carefully documents. You have my pledge that we will marshal this institution's resources, our intellectual resources, our reputational resources, and yes, our financial resources, to try and help repair the damage that slavery was caused by slavery and its legacy. We formed an implementation planning committee, which is being chaired by Martha Minow, the 300th anniversary university professor, the former dean of the Harvard Law School, someone who's written a really important book on repair herself, and also a member of Tomiko's committee. The committee has already begun to meet and will begin its work in earnest this summer after we all get through this semester. One day, all of us will be, let's face it, figures in history to the people of Harvard, heirs to the legacy that we begin to create now. My hope is that those who succeed us will look back and judge us to have been champions of veritas, to have stood for truth, and to have acted upon it. This is the role that I hope we all collectively will play in history. And, like my friend Ruth Simmons, that we will be judged to have had the fortitude that Ruth demonstrated to address injustices long obscured, injustices that continue to shape our country and this institution today. Fortunately, the Harvard that I have known in my lifetime, the Harvard which candidly I love, and I hope many of you do as well, is a community that is devoted to truth, a community that's devoted to excellence, a community that is devoted to opportunity. In releasing this report and committing ourselves to following through on its recommendation, we also uphold another Harvard tradition, that we do not shy away from difficult challenges, that we embrace them, that we do so with the intention of making meaningful change. Meaningful change is a powerful thing indeed. The work that we do begins today. Thank you all for being part of it.
Thank you, President Bacow, and thank you all for being here today. This morning, I have the high honor of introducing our next speaker, Professor Tracy K. Smith. Professor Smith is the Suzannah S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute and Professor of African and African American Studies here at Harvard University's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. My name is Suzannah Omonuk, and I'm a student at the Divinity School, and I got introduced to this initiative by writing a poem from the point of view of Venus, one of the enslaved young women here at Harvard. She was enslaved by Benjamin Wadsworth, who was Harvard's 8th president. The words you're about to hear from Professor Smith are no ordinary words. You see, I believe that the message that she's about to impart has traveled here through the vastness of space and the evanescence of time to meet you. As a student at Harvard Divinity School, I'm trained to investigate the sacred, so I hope you will indulge my analogy when I say that the poet is often simply the vessel through which ancient truths are communicated. And even as we confront the gory nature of this institution's genesis, I invite you all to consider that perhaps that great line that splits time down the middle is not as thick as we imagine it is. Maybe right here and right now, we're all inhabiting that liminal space, sitting exactly at the boundary that separates the past from the future, night from day, and here, suspended between meter and measure, we can shatter the hourglass. And so, even while it is true that the blood of the enslaved flows like a river, beneath this very ground, the poet uses it as the scarlet-tinged ink with which they write the story of the often forgotten back into history. History as it happened, but also history as it should have happened. I am utterly fascinated by this notion of viewing the Black artist as someone with a unique ability to harness the collective imagination of the masses to paint or dance or scribble a new cosmos into existence, a world in which we too can be called beautiful. And this great undertaking of speaking into being a new universe, breath by breath and word by word, has been the theme of Professor Smith's work, from her undergraduate days here at Harvard to a permanent place at some of the world's greatest literary halls of fame. She won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 2012 for her poetry collection, Life on Mars, and served as the 22nd Poet Laureate of the United States from 2017 to 2019. She has authored 4 other stunning poetry collections: The Body's Question, which won the Cave Canem Poetry Prize in 2002, Duende, which won her a James Laughlin Award and Essence Literary Award, Wade in the Water, the winner of the 2019 Anisfield Wald Book Award in Poetry, and her most recent collection, Such Color, New and Selected Poems, which was released in October of 2021. Such Color tells the stark truth about the injustices, old and new, that have plagued Black people in America for centuries. But she also speaks the other half of the story. And that story is that both the earliest history and the imminent future of Blackness converge in a time-defying loop of glory. And that though death and Hades tried to swallow us up, we are still here, eternal and gloriously so. Therefore, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tracy K. Smith.
Suzannah, thank you so much. I'm so moved by your words, and I'm so happy to feel the belief in language and the imagination enter the room in your voice. I am eager to share with you a few sections of a poem called I Will Tell You the Truth About This, I Will Tell You All About It, which I built from archival letters written by African Americans who served in the Union Army during the Civil War, as well as letters that their family members wrote to them and to President Lincoln. The poem also includes excerpts of deposition statements that these veterans gave after the war, as well as their widows and descendants, in an attempt to claim the pensions that as US veterans they ought to have been entitled to, and needless to say, that was often a difficult or impossible quest for many of them. I will tell you the truth about this. I will tell you all about it. Carlisle, Pennsylvania, November 21st, 1864. Mr. Abraham Lincoln, I want to know, sir, if you please, whether I can have my son released from the Army. He is all the support I have now his father is dead and his brother. That was all the help I had. He has been wounded twice. He has not had nothing to send me yet. Now I am old, and my head is blossoming for the grave. And if you do, I hope the Lord will bless you and me. They say that you will sympathize with the poor. He belonged to the 8th Regiment Colored Troops. He is a sergeant. Mart Welcome is his name. Benton Barracks Hospital, St. Louis, Missouri, September 3rd, 1864. My children, I take my pen in hand to write you a few lines to let you know that I have not forgot you. Be assured that I will have you if it cost me my life. On the 28th of the month, 800 white and 800 black soldiers expects to start up the river to Glasgow. When they come, I expect to be with them and expect to get you both in return. Your Miss Katie said that I tried to steal you. You tell her from me that if she meets me with 10,000 soldiers, she will meet her enemy. Give my love to all inquiring friends. Tell them all that we are well. Nashville, Tennessee, August 12th, 1865. Dear wife, I am earnest about you coming, and that as soon as possible. It is no use to say anything about any money, for if you come up here, which I hope you will, it will be all right as to the money matters. I want to see you and the children very bad. I can get a house at any time I will say the word, so you need not fear as to that. So come, right on, just as soon as you get this. I want you to tell me the name of the baby that was born since I left. I am your affectionate husband till death. Bel Air, Maryland, August 25th, 1864. Mr. President, it is my desire to be free, to go to see my people on the Eastern Shore. My mistress won't let me. You will please let me know if we are free and what I can do. Clarksville, Tennessee, August 28th, 1865. Dear husband, I guess you would like to know the reason why that I did not come when you wrote for, and that is because I had not the money and could not get it. And if you will send me the money or come after me, I will come. They sent out soldiers from here after old Riley, and they have got him in jail and one of his sons, and they have his brother Elias here in jail. Dear husband, if you are coming after me, I want you to come before it get too cold. Florence, Alabama, December 7th, 1866. Dear sir, I take the pleasure of writing you a few lines, hoping that I will not offend you by doing so. I was raised in your state and was sold from there when I was 31 years old, left wife, one child, mother, brothers, and sisters. My wife died about 12 years ago, and 10 years ago, I made money and went back and bought my old mother, and she lives with me. 7 years ago, I married again and commenced to buy myself and wife for $2,000. And last Christmas, I made the last payment, and I have made some little money this year, and I wish to get my kind all with me. And I will take it as a great favor if you can help me get them. I'm now delighted to invite the first panel to the stage to discuss universities and their role in the repair of legacies of slavery. And while they come and take their seats, we'll hear a brief introduction from Harvard Graduate School of Education doctoral student Shandra M. Jones.
Good morning, and thank you for joining this forum, telling the truth about all this, reckoning with slavery and its legacies at Harvard and beyond. My name is Shandra Jones, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Harvard Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. I'm thrilled to be with you here virtually this morning because this forum marks a moment of celebration of the scholarship that contributed to the committee's reports and recommendations after 2 years of research and engaged programming and processes. But the forum also marks a moment of deep reflection and strategic work to identify and begin to activate around a set of thoughtful and intentional next steps that really help us step into a new reality that embraces bold institutional power in the midst of a context in which we see a quickly evolving demographic shift in the US, as well as contested but continued pluralistic ideas of community on a global scale. And when I was asked to introduce this panel, I began thinking immediately about the relationship that universities and colleges have with the individuals that inhabit them. We know and have known that there is a bi-directional relationship between the institution by which it's not only shaped by those in it, but is shaping those who enter its orbit as well. And it is that bi-directional interrelation that amplifies the need for us to do three things: to eschew ideas of institutional innocence and institutional ambiguity as relates to institutional legacies of slavery. It also encourages us and urges us to embrace new principles, to really think about the principles that will be our guiding lights as we move forward beyond the forum. Perhaps those could be principles akin to restorative justice principles, principles that recognize past wrongdoings as a violation of the people and the relationships with people. Perhaps they're principles that embrace the idea that there is contemporary residue from wrongdoings that need to not only be acknowledged, but also embraces the idea that healing and righting wrongs requires action verbs, that validation and vindication, testimony and community dialogue don't just happen. But third, that interrelation encourages us to also see this forum as a start. It's the fora like this by which advocates, such as those who've been knocking at the door for years in divestment groups, both for climate justice as well as to encourage reinvestment away from prison industrial complex institutions, but also those folks who are at the table now and those folks who've been doing work for decades to complexify ideas of student success within institutions with legacies of slavery. All of that is the start of a really necessary and rich dialogue that this forum initiates here at Harvard. And what I know for sure is that Harvard has a unique position in higher education and in education more broadly, and therefore can be a symbolic leader, really beckoning other institutions to similarly invite voices to the table and confront boldly the lack of institutional innocence and embrace their power as an actor and as a key stakeholder in repairing legacies of slavery. And it is with that I am excited to introduce this panel. We first have Jody Lynn Allen, Assistant Professor of History and Robert Francis Ing's Director of the Lemon Project, A Journey of Reconciliation at the College of William and Mary. Next, we have Adam Harris, staff writer for The Atlantic and author of The State Must Provide, Why America's Colleges Have Always Been Unequal. And finally, Kemiyawe Wapepa, doctoral student at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And then we're joined by our illustrious moderator, Nancy Keene, James E. Robeson Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Thank you so much and welcome to this panel.
Good morning. Welcome to our first panel at this just very, very thought-provoking and very important convocation that's happening in person and virtual. I'm a historian. I study leaders, past and present, with big, worthy causes and what we can learn from them today in our own, shall we say, slightly turbulent and very, very high-stakes moment. I was privileged, underline privileged, to be a part of the committee, both because I was exposed to an astounding assortment of thoughtful people and their rigorous work, because I got to learn a lot about courageous leadership from Tomiko Brown and her amazing team, because Larry Bacow has been so supportive, and because I've spent a great deal of my time studying leaders like Frederick Douglass. So let me start with Mr. Douglass. So Douglass escaped from slavery. He was born either in 1818 or 1819. He escaped from slavery when he was 21. Just a year or two after his escape and his residence with his wife and young children in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Wendell Phillips and a few other white abolitionists recruited him to be a spokesman for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, which he started doing, explaining his experience. And he was a very extraordinary orator, keen intelligence, keen integrative thinker. And pretty soon he chafes under what he saw as restrictions of simply telling his story. What he wanted to talk about in the early 1840s on the speaker circuit was what he called the tentacular reach of slavery. A tentacular reach that was shared in, that was clung to by Philadelphia smokers who bought tobacco that was raised and farmed and harvested by Americans that were owned by other Americans, by enslaved black women and children. If you were a lawyer in Boston having anything to do with the shipping trade, your work and your livelihood and your family's lives depended on the trade and commodities and extraordinary connections, social, political, and economic, that had grown up around the commodities, especially cotton now gaining speed, in an economy that was dependent in many, many, today morally repugnant ways, but extraordinarily important economic ways. If you were a merchant, if you were a member of the Harvard faculty and administration in 1840, some of the money, not all of it, but a great deal of the money that flowed through Harvard was related to, as President Bacow's example of Thomas Oliver gives us, was related to people who directly benefited from or participated in all the different ways in which slavery was part and parcel of the American experience, in which Americans owned by other Americans did so very, very much in such unjust circumstances to create our nation. And so Douglass talked about this in great detail. But I kept coming back to him during the last 2 years, because what the committee's report does at a couple of levels is, one, it shows us that tentacular reach, right? Not only in the people, the 70 black Americans enslaved by members of the Harvard community, and not only in the extraordinary moments of discrimination and inequity that lots of black members of the Harvard community experienced, and not only in race science as practiced by people like Professor Louis Agassiz, but also in the money that flowed so importantly to and from Harvard, because Harvard didn't just receive contributions from men who were involved in the slave trade or directly benefited from it, people like Abbott Lawrence of textile mill fame. But also, Harvard was an enormously successful lender through much of its history all the way into the mid-19th century, and a lot of that money went to interests and people directly involved in slavery. So the tentacular reach that Douglass saw 180 years ago, right, was incredibly important to the growth and mission and possibilities of this university. So the first thing I saw and see is the clarity of that. And the second thing, and I'll stop here, was the incredibly important and yet still largely understated social and political role and economic role that universities play in the experience and in the history and in the making of the present of our society. And so for us to be here in that moment with that kind of background and this kind of charge, because the document is about Harvard's past, but as Tomiko and Larry have said, it has to be even more about our future, right? As Mandela and C.T. Vivian and Martin Luther King and John Lewis, Diane Nash, as Brian Stevenson and Tomiko and Larry have said, if we don't understand where we came from, we can't do our true and meaningful work to make our future much more equitable, much more just, and to push the boulder of goodness forward. So here we are with universities and their role in the repair of the legacy of slavery. It's my privilege to turn the mic over to Adam Harris, who knows a great deal about this subject.
Thank you so much, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all for this conversation about, as well as remembrance of the role institutions played in slavery, the lasting legacy of that involvement, and the propulsive and equitable momentum that slavery and segregation created for our higher education system and the students it serves today. The United States has long had an antagonistic relationship with black education, to say the least, stymieing it even before the country's founding dates. South Carolina made it a crime to teach an enslaved person to read or write in 1740. Georgia followed suit 17 years later, as several other states did. And this was the environment that John G. Fee, a Presbyterian minister from Bracken County, Kentucky, had been born into. His father was an enslaver, but Fee bucked his family's tradition. He was a deeply religious man who would later write in his autobiography that when he went off to Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati, he was convinced that slavery ran afoul of religious doctrine, and that for him to take part in the unjust institution would be to sin himself. But his time at Lane and the spiritual conviction that it gave him provided him more ambitious ideas as well. Fee wanted to create an institution in Kentucky based on a biblical foundation. God has made of one blood all the people of the earth. Alongside others, Fee would establish the college Berea in the middle of the 1850s as an integrated coeducational institution, the first of its kind in the South. You see, there's this idea that people can only be judged by the standards of their time, but in a time of an explosion of higher education, there were people who were already thinking about equity. As Fee was setting up his institution, an idea had been bubbling up in the national imagination: land-grant colleges. There were places to teach the art of manslaying and to places to train lawyers and doctors, but there were not places to teach workers, to fulfill the founders' idea that higher education would be the place to build good citizens. As Justin Murrill, the legislation's champion who it would come to be named for, said, "Shall we not have schools to teach men the way to feed, clothe, and enlighten the great brotherhood of man?" But, of course, the government's definition of men who should be taught did not extend to everyone. The first Murrill Act passed in 1862 and gave states land which they could sell in order to fund a university. The first state to accept this land was Iowa, where a fledgling Iowa State University would receive the grant. Other states followed. In total, 17,430,000 acres of land, including more than 10 million acres expropriated from nearly 250 indigenous tribes, was doled out under the act. But the institutions funded with this money rarely enrolled black students. One state, Mississippi, did decide it was best to fund a college for black students, as faculty at the University of Mississippi said that they would rather resign and the college close than to teach one. So in 1871, the Reconstruction government in the state created Alcorn State University, providing it with a guaranteed appropriation of $50,000 a year for at least a decade. But when so-called redeemers swept back into power, ushering in a quote-unquote white revolution, that appropriation was reduced to $15,000 in 1875, and again to $5,500 in 1876. So both the state and the flagship became engines of inequality and wealth stratification. It would take nearly 30 more years and a second Morrill Act with an addendum for Iowa State to enroll its first black student, George Washington Carver. The second Morrill Act had been the result of the inadequacy of the first Morrill Act's funding. The predominantly and in most cases exclusively white institutions created by the act needed more money to fulfill their mission. States that ultimately accepted the new funding could not make a distinction of race or color in the admission of students, but there was a caveat. States could operate separate colleges for black students. So 6 years before the legal enshrinement of separate but equal, America's higher education infrastructure had already glommed onto the idea. States used a portion of the windfall to support colleges for black students, but others chose to accept black students in paltry numbers, like Iowa State, where the students were often housed in substandard conditions. Carver, for example, lived in a vacant office and took his meals in the basement because he was not allowed to eat in the dining halls. Desegregation is not integration. Carver's social isolation at Iowa's land-grant mirrored the deterioration of interracial harmony that would soon come to Berea, which was fighting to maintain funding during a national decline of interest in supporting programs that propped up interracial education or black education at all. The school had gone from being roughly 50% black and 50% white to overwhelmingly white as they sought to attract donations. Then the state decided that even that stagnant black enrollment was too much, and in 1904 passed the Day Law, which banned interracial education in Kentucky schools, both public and private. And the law was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1908. During that Jim Crow era, states continued to undercut black colleges, where a majority of the nation's black students, if they went to college, attended. You see, it would be one thing if black colleges and the students who attended them were just an afterthought, but there's evidence that time and again, states examined the issues that they had with the institutions, knew what they were doing, and blatantly looked the other way. In the second decade of the 20th century, Kentucky's superintendent of schools invited William T.B. Williams, a professor at Hampton Institute who had also taught at Tuskegee, to investigate the conditions of the Kentucky Normal and Industrial Institute. When Williams ultimately issued his report, he pulled no punches. The buildings were unfinished. The girls' dorm lacked fire escapes. The boys' dorm was literally in a mud puddle. There was no power or lighting or machinery in the electrical plant. The teachers were underpaid. The bright spot was the student body, he wrote, who were mature and of a high average of ability. But it would require radical departures from established plans and operations to bring the institution up to speed. The state was willing to pay $40,000 to do it. It was nowhere close to the amount that would be needed. By the middle of the 1940s, when President Harry Truman commissioned a Commission for Higher Education and American Democracy, the commission ultimately reported that the disparity in funding between predominantly white institutions in Kentucky and black institutions, a disparity that they had known about since the early 20th century, was among the worst in the nation at 42-1. I don't single out Kentucky because it was anomalous. Across the country, students would make some of the same complaints. Their professors were great, but their campuses were in dire need of repair. Their green spaces would flood and they just wouldn't drain right. And to add insult to injury, they didn't have the same programs, undergraduate or graduate, that many predominantly white institutions had. So the NAACP and other groups began to challenge those situations, arguing that states at the very least had a responsibility to establish separate programs for black students. In the 1940s and early 50s, Oklahoma became the premier battleground for these fights. Two suits in particular, one involving Ada Louise Sipple Fisher, a young black woman who wanted to study at the University of Oklahoma School of Law, and another involving George McLaurin, who hoped to attend the graduate school, laid the groundwork for Brown v. Board of Education. The cases showed in great detail the lengths that states would go to maintain the facade of separate but equal. Oklahoma tried everything it could to keep Fisher out of its white law school. When the Supreme Court said that Oklahoma would have to enroll her, they rushed a law school into existence and hired its faculty in 5 days. Then when McLaurin's case leapfrogged Fisher, he became the first black student to attend the university, he was physically separated into an anteroom, looking into the classroom while his classmates learned. When a court decided that that was too much, the university placed a physical bar in the classrooms to divide black and white students. But the barriers to legal segregation did eventually come down, even if their vestiges remain. In the 1960s, predominantly white institutions began to open their doors to more black students, though in some cases, the move was somewhat self-serving, as there was now a federal penalty attached to discriminating against students based on their race. So what are we supposed to do with that history? What do we do with centuries worth of knowledge of the legacy of the donations tied to slavery, barred entry from historically white institutions for black students, underfunded institutions for black students, and a philanthropic ebb and flow that has not been reliable for black colleges? How do institutions themselves begin to make amends for that legacy? If we let history guide us, it will tell us that commitments to amends need to be sustained. The momentum that our inequitable system has built will not be blunted in a week, a year, a decade. It requires consistency from the institutions that benefited from slavery and segregation, while colleges that were serving marginalized and minoritized students were starved of funding, from the governments that cultivated and provided safe harbor for the discrimination to thrive. And it requires consistent thought about how to rebuild systems with equity at the root. We know what happens without that consistency. A $40,000 initial investment in Kentucky State to make it more like Tuskegee with little in the way of additional support couldn't prevent the state from having the worst funding disparity in the nation. It's places like Auburn University being told by a federal judge on the same day that Bo Jackson was being celebrated and named as the Heisman that it operated the most segregated institution in the state of Alabama and continuing to enroll paltry numbers of black students. Higher education, both public and private institutions, have provided time and again for white students, and now they must do the same for those who they have tried to hold back.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. That was terrific. Jody.
Okay. Good morning.
Wow.
First, I want to thank the Planning Committee for inviting me to be here with you at this very exciting moment in Harvard's history. I'm honored to be here. It's always good to be in the company of people interested in doing the reparatory work necessary to right the wrongs that have taken place for centuries in higher education. This is not easy work, but it is necessary. My task this morning is to share with you some of the work we're doing at William & Mary as we confront the legacies of slavery on campus and in the greater Williamsburg community. It's been 15 years since the Student Assembly passed a resolution calling on William & Mary to research its history as an enslaver, make that history public, and establish a memorial to the enslaved men, women, and children who stand at the very foundation of the institution. This 2008 resolution was followed by one from the Faculty Assembly. Together, these resolutions prompted the administration to invite historian Dr. Robert Ings, then on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania, to spend a semester on campus working with graduate students and a faculty committee. Bob wrote a report that the Board of Visitors used to pass its own resolution acknowledging William & Mary's role as an enslaver and an adherent of Jim Crow policies, and being a poor neighbor in general to the African American community. The last step was to establish, the Lemon Project, a journey of reconciliation. So what is William & Mary's story? In February, the institution celebrated its 329th Charter Day. And for the first 316 years of its existence, this highly regarded institution, dubbed the alma mater of a nation, miseducated its students. Now you may ask how I can sit here and say that and have a job on Monday. And I can say it because William & Mary is not alone. Most, if not all, institutions of higher education in this country and abroad are guilty of this practice. Generations of students have entered the hallowed halls of academia expecting to learn what they needed to know to become successful citizens, to learn about themselves, the world they inhabit, and how and where they fit. But they've only ever, heard part of the story. Prior to the Civil War, most people understood slavery to simply be a part of life in this country, and were taught that it was the greater good for everyone, including the enslaved. After the war, they soon learned of the lost cause, a manufactured retelling of the causes and outcomes of the Civil War. In both instances, the students never learned about the contributions of Africans and African Americans, or that the land they stood on was stolen from indigenous peoples. Over the past 3 centuries, William and Mary has produced lawyers, scientists, businessmen, college professors, and perhaps most importantly, public school teachers. While not everyone will go to college or a university, most children will enter the public school system where they will be taught by college-educated teachers. The bottom line is, it is the responsibility of institutions of higher education to teach teachers who then teach our children. Educators have a lot of power and a huge responsibility, and it is the responsibility of colleges and universities to prepare them, to fully prepare them. So how does the Lemon Project fit into this picture? The Lemon Project is the second university-funded endeavor of its kind. Of course, the first being Brown University, AKA the mothership, under the leadership of Dr. Ruth Simmons. Thank you, Dr. Simmons. The Lemon Project opened for business in the fall of 2010. At that time, the leadership consisted of an advisory committee and 2 co-chairs. I was hired as the coordinator, along with a fellow who was a doctoral candidate in the history department. We were responsible for the day-to-day operations of the project. That first semester, the fellow and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what we were going to do. We were so excited when Emory University announced the first conference on slavery and the university. We attended and met lots of people trying to answer the same questions. What do we do and how do we do it? When we returned from Atlanta, we began planning our first symposium. Our goal was to hear from the local community about what they needed and wanted, and our task was to listen. Based on feedback gathered during the symposium, oral histories, listening sessions, it was clear that we had our work cut out for us. William and Mary's past interactions with the community had left scars, and the cultural memory was long and deep. As the saying goes, the Black community felt some kind of way about William and Mary. Some people saw the institution as simply a place of employment, but they knew that they were not welcome on campus after hours unless, quote, they were pushing a broom.
Oh my God.
Those who did not work there simply ignored the school. It was not a place that was going to educate them or their families, and that was okay, because they knew that for over 300 years, William and Mary had taught its students to believe in the inferiority of an entire race of people, and they stayed away to protect themselves and their children. So how do you begin to address this type of antipathy? You certainly can't do it overnight, and it couldn't be done in 8 years, the original projected length of the project. So what we did after the symposia and the listening sessions and talking in the community, we came up with 3 broad goals: to conduct the archival research necessary to tell the full story of the history of William and Mary, to work on building a bridge between the university and the greater Williamsburg African American community, and to encourage programming and events and support on campus for current students, because the problems had not gone away. In recent years, we have added a 4th goal, which is to support and collaborate with other institutions during this work through the University Studying Slavery Consortium. So working to achieve this goal, these goals, we've been quite busy over the last decade or so. And while I don't have time to cover all of our initiatives, I will highlight a few. First, teaching, of course, it's very, very important. That's what we're there to do. And we make our research available to faculty on campus. All of the classes I teach we incorporate our findings in the archives. We also recently, in the last 2 years, started a genealogy initiative. We'd heard from the beginning that there were people in the Black community who felt they were descended from people enslaved by William and Mary. And many just wanted to learn to do their own genealogy. They just wanted to know their history. And we didn't have the bandwidth for a long time, but recently, William and Mary received a Mellon grant, and our portion of that grant was a doctoral fellow who focuses on who's developed an amazing genealogy program, and the community has responded no holds barred. They're really enjoying it and very appreciative of it. Lastly, I want to tell you about our memorial to the enslaved. If you remember back, I mentioned that the third request as part of the student resolution was a memorial to the enslaved. In these last few minutes, I'm delighted to tell you that on May 7th, we will dedicate the Hearth Memorial to the Enslaved. It will include the names of 199 individuals, 94 of whom we have names, and the remainder are all unknown, or as I refer to them as sightings in the record. We find an enslaved carpenter, an enslaved wheelwright, sometimes just an unknown enslaved, we don't even know the gender. But through our research, we've uncovered 199 people.
These are people who were
enslaved by William and Mary.
By William and Mary.
Yes.
Thank you, just for clarity.
Yes. We recently had a meeting with the Student Assembly, a listening session, and the big question was, is the Lemon Project done? And our answer is, of course not. We're not even sure we're in the middle of this. And so the work will continue, and I will end here and look forward to the question and answers. Thank you.
Great. Now, this is so interesting. Please, Cami.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Jody.
I would like to begin with a story which illustrates the urgency and importance of addressing the legacy of slavery. This narrative, from Dr. Anthony Jack's forthcoming book, When Campus Closed, with Princeton University Press, shares the contrasting experiences of two Harvard undergraduates, Hannah and Emily. Dr. Jack writes, like veggies, fresh air does the body good. The mind, too, many studies show. Runners Hannah and Emily, both slender yet toned, extol the joys of exercise. Their paths never crossed at Harvard, but they revel in the singular joy of mile markers passing by on one's periphery. Distance was their forte. Competitive running filled their adolescent schedules. Hannah gleefully returned to her passion when campus closed. Emily, however, could not. Hannah, blonde and blue-eyed, shares how running outdoors is a family affair. Her parents introduced her to running. It was how they bonded, growing closer as the runs grew longer. Hannah savored her return home in March 2020, partly because of time with family, and partly because, quote, we do a lot of hiking, running, biking. When I come home, I exercise a lot more because I like exercising outdoors. Not all students were so lucky. Privileged Black, Latino, and Native students spoke about similar protections granted by their more affluent communities. Unlike their white peers, however, they noted how racism, interpersonal and structural, punctured their bubbles like needles through hot wax. Emily, affable and kind, comes from an upper-class neighborhood that put everything at her fingertips. Tons of food places within walking distance, local grocery stores, banks. With an inviting smile, she notes, we honestly have everything. Well, almost everything. Emily, fair-skinned with 4C curls, worries about details her white peers never have. For me, Ahmaud Arbery, his death, was the one that really shook me the most. I go running outside my neighborhood all the time. And the fact that you could just be running, minding your own business, and someone could shoot you, that's scary. Arbery's murder made the invisible yet ever-present boundary between her community and her neighborhood more pronounced. Even though you live here, you have a house here, all they see is your skin color. Two students, arguably from similar worlds, yet drastically different experiences. Hannah got more exercise, a welcomed release from the stresses of the pandemic, and Emily got less. Moreover, the reasons why left her more troubled than tranquil. Many people take for granted the ability to walk down the streets in a neighborhood they call home. For some, however, stretching one's legs is a luxury that could cost your life. Affluent students at Harvard, like Hannah, know the former. Black, Latino, and Native undergraduates from all socioeconomic backgrounds, like Emily, grapple with the latter. And what happens at home affects what happens at Harvard. In January 2021, Dr. Anthony Abraham Jack and a team of graduate student researchers, including Shandra Jones, who you heard from earlier, Dwayne Bell, Becca Bassett, and myself, began data collection for a research project funded through the Harvard and the Legacy for Slavery initiative. Over the course of a year, we collected 174 narrative life history interviews with 122 different Asian, Black, Latinx, Native, and white undergraduates at Harvard University. These interviews, many over 4 hours long, provided insight into these students' perspectives and experiences both before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. While our findings from this study are still emerging, the stories that students have entrusted us with clearly illustrate the ways in which the racial and economic inequalities rooted in the legacy of slavery continue to actively shape the lives and experiences of students in ways that Harvard and other universities must acutely account for. To illustrate that point, I'd like to share with you 3 more stories. I'll begin with Dawn. On March 10th, 2020, Dawn, like every other Harvard student, was shocked and confused to learn that campus was closing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. While her white and more affluent classmates took this opportunity to attend darties, or day parties, and play with pogo sticks in the Kirkland House courtyard, Dawn fought back tears, worrying about the consequences of her unexpected return home. She recalls, "My mom is not expecting another mouth to feed in the house for another few months. How is that going to work out?" Dawn's mother lost her job due to the pandemic, and Dawn, who had lost her 3 paid on-campus positions when she returned home, was unable to help out financially. As the spring of 2020 unfolded, Dawn and her mother faced a variety of challenges, including electrical shutoffs and missed meals. Although a $5,000 rebate provided by the Harvard Financial Aid Office helped Dawn and her mother stay afloat, Dawn couldn't help but feeling abandoned by the institution that had provided her with so much stability just a few weeks prior. Dawn explains, "I felt like I had gotten a taste of what comfort and safety felt like, and then immediately it was pulled out from under me. I just felt this cruel reminder that these things are not mine because this is not the circle I was born into. I'm just a passenger here for 4 years, and Harvard can choose when they want to take that away for their own convenience." For Dawn, a first-generation Black student on full financial aid, Harvard enrollment alone was not enough to protect her from the deeply impactful racial and economic inequities that shaped her day-to-day life. Our second story comes from Angelica. Angelica has been playing tennis for as long as she can remember. As one of only 2 Black women on Harvard's varsity tennis team, Angelica has always quietly navigated the divide between her predominantly white sport and the predominantly Black social and familial world of her home. However, after George Floyd was killed in the summer of 2020, Angelica could no longer set aside her experiences as a Black woman when she stepped onto the tennis court. Starting that summer, Angelica took on the responsibility of educating her non-Black tennis teammates about racism. Angelica shares, "When everything was happening in the summer, my other Black teammate and I took our initiative to create a space where we're having conversations about what's going on. We're having our teammates read books, educating themselves. We're having the team donate to specific organizations, explaining why we're donating and what else we can do. So we've made our point as Black women that this has deeply affected us. We made it a point to do everything." On top of navigating challenging academic courses, maintaining a strenuous varsity sports schedule, and keeping up with all the other responsibilities of being a high-achieving young adult, Angelica feels responsible for, quote, "doing everything," to educate her peers about anti-Black racism. Our third story comes from Amanda. On January 6, 2021, Amanda was at her family home near Washington, D.C. She was working on her senior thesis, a project that she had been looking forward to for years. With a big grin, she admits, "I was actually really looking forward to writing a senior thesis since high school. I was like that nerd. I can't wait to write a senior thesis. I was so excited." That afternoon, however, Amanda's concentration was interrupted by a frantic phone call from her mother. Amanda explains, "My mom is calling me from work, hysterical, because she's seeing on the news about the riot that's happening at the US Capitol." Although Amanda felt safe at home, she immediately began to worry about her dad and brother, both of whom were Black men in close proximity to the US Capitol that day. All work on her senior thesis came to a screeching halt. As she recalls, "It felt so wildly inappropriate to even look at my computer, to even consider working on my thesis. I just basically sat in the house all day crying, watching the news, anxiously calling my dad and brother because the calls weren't going through." Although Amanda's dad and brother eventually made it home unscathed, the whole family felt shaken and emotionally drained by the events of January 6th. It wasn't until Amanda returned to campus for her final semester of college a few weeks later that she was able to fully refocus on her beloved senior thesis project. As these stories reveal, the legacy of slavery is ongoing, laying waste to the metaphor of a college bubble. The legacy of slavery impacts the daily lives and experiences of all Harvard students, especially Black and Native students. This is apparent in the stark contrast between Hannah and Emily's ability to feel safe exercising in their own neighborhoods. This is apparent in the financial instability that Dawn and her mother faced both before and during the pandemic. This is apparent in the obligation that Angelica feels to educate her non-Black classmates about racism. And this is apparent in the anxiety that Amanda experienced as she worried about losing her father and brother to racially motivated violence in our nation's capital. Students come to Harvard as whole human beings, and with them, they bring the realities of the lived experiences of racism and economic inequality. Emily, Dawn, Angelica, and Amanda cannot ignore these realities, and by inviting these students to campus, neither can Harvard. It is encouraging to see that Harvard's recently released report contains recommendations to engage in close and genuine partnership with Black and Native communities and to support the direct descendants of enslaved people. But these partnerships must better account for where students are coming from right now. When taking action on these recommendations, it is my hope that Harvard will continue to seek out and listen to the voices of its students, allowing their stories to shape this process of redress. Thank you.
Wow. I feel privileged to be among these leaders and these thinkers and these students of vital experience. I want to start with Kemi, who is telling stories, right, from inductive, extensive, rigorous interview research. Kemi, what surprised you the most? How long have you been doing this? You've been doing it for a while, correct?
Yeah, so we conducted most of the interviews throughout 2021. We did a couple follow-ups recently, but now we're...
And what surprised you the most?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think actually what surprised me the most was how much students needed this outlet. At first,
to tell their stories?
Yeah, to tell their stories, yeah. At first we were unsure of how comfortable students would feel being open, you know, especially in the moment when many of them were still living off campus, many of them at their family homes. You know, how much would they actually want to share about this experience? But I can't tell you the number of times when speaking with students that they just expressed how, wow, I've never actually really had a moment to stop and reflect on this yet, or wow, it was really great to be able to get that off my chest. And I think to me that just shows the importance of making sure that we are intentionally creating space for students to be able to express themselves and to share what's going on in their lives.
And what, just following up, is really interesting. What has impressed you the most? I mean, in terms of, and I'm really talking about in here, not up here. Mm-hmm. In here, and at your heart, what will stay with you what stays with you as you walk home after a day of writing or thinking or conducting these kind of interviews, this storytelling?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, what stays with me is just the similarities. So I was an undergraduate at Harvard as well. I graduated back in 2009. And just listening to these students' stories, at times it's discouraging how little has actually changed in the time since I've graduated. For me, I identify as Native American, and I spoke to 14 Native American students as a part of this project, and hearing their frustrations with the lack of recognition from the university and the lack of commitment to actually meeting the needs of Native students on campus was really important, and I think the same goes for Black students as well.
Thank you. Adam, you ended by saying, and by the way, folks, we're going to leave plenty of time for your questions, either those folks that are here or are many folks joining us virtually. So please just send them into Slido. I've got even this historian, technological light, I think can manage to get the questions out. So Adam, you said at the very end of, again, just extremely thought-provoking, distillations or important bits of your research, illustrative parts of your research. You said sustained, you emphasized that word, sustained commitments. Give us an example.
Yeah, so I think that when you think about sustained commitments, I think, as I mentioned, right, it's not a thing that's going to be solved in a week. It's not a thing that's going to be solved in a decade. I often think about Mississippi's HBCUs in particular, because Mississippi was a state in 1975. Black Mississippians filed a lawsuit that was effectively arguing that the state had been underfunding and undercutting its black colleges for a century at that point, and this lawsuit sort of worked its way through the court. It defined what it meant for a state to, fundamentally desegregate its higher education system, and it ultimately came to a settlement: $500 million over 17 years, split between the 3 HBCUs. And just looking at that in its own right, that seems like a lot of money over a long stretch of time. But if you think about it, right, the University of Mississippi can make $500 million in 5 years of private donations. So that $500 million, is that going to account for that long legacy of slavery and segregation? Is it going to account for the fact that Ole Miss for decades was blocking students from attending the university, and that the faculty said it would rather resign and the college close than to enroll a black student? And so when I think about that sort of sustained investment in making something equitable, I think it has to begin with making an earnest assessment of the situation, right? Maryland also recently had one of these settlements, $577 million over 10 years, split between 4 colleges, when an expert witness said that it would need at least $2.73 billion in order to begin to address the legacy of slavery and segregation. And so it needs to be something that is not just a one-time line item in the budget. It needs to be something that is a continual line item. It's something that can very easily fall by the wayside. Yeah. I think the last thing that I'll say is, there was a real fervor from the federal government to really enforce the laws around some of the discriminatory practices for HBCUs, but also for black students more broadly in the 1970s. And as the Carter administration phased into the Reagan administration, they had been investigating North Carolina. They were saying, you look at the autoclaves, these sort of high-tech pressure cookers used to sterilize laboratory equipment. A place like NC State had 40 of these. The 2 HBCUs, or 2 of the HBCUs, North Carolina Central and North Carolina A&T, had 3 between the 2 of them. And they were like, this is a prime example of the disparity between these institutions. But when the Reagan administration comes in, they ultimately settle with the state. And the former head of the Office for Civil Rights at the old Department for Education, Health, Education, and Welfare said, this settlement doesn't read like a desegregation plan. It reads like a joint U.S.-North Carolina defense of everything the system did wrong. And so...
one and done, right?
One and done.
One and done. That's what we're hearing from you.
And effectively, yes. It was a sort of one and done thing, and I think that can't happen if we hope to build an equitable future.
Really interesting. Here. Let's go to Jody. So Jody, when you said twice in your extraordinarily understated and completely powerful way that William and Mary educates a great number, as all universities do, of teachers. Mm-hmm. I felt just people draw their breath in the room, as I did. So, and also the other thing is that was, again, just such a flash of extraordinary important truth that is easily missed by lots and lots of certainly white folks and lots of folks in lots of places. Now, you've been doing this on the Lemon Project at William & Mary for a decade at least. Mm-hmm. What impact do you think your work, the work you lead, many people involved, the work you lead has had, say, for example, on teaching? If there's any that you can discern, talk to us about it. This is important. Impact is ultimately what this is about, folks. So talk to us about that from your bird's eye view, please.
Well, I can't really address how teachers have taken this into their classrooms. Actually, though, except to say, you all have a student, a teacher here in Massachusetts who I believe has won Teacher of the Year. He's a William & Mary product. And okay. He recently was interviewed by the school alumni magazine, and he talks about coming in intending to major in something else. I forget exactly what, but he decided to become a history teacher. And from what I can tell on Facebook and stories I hear, he's doing a phenomenal job. So that's one example for sure I can give you. I know that we are, as I said earlier, the research that we are finding is available through our website to everyone if they want to use it. We just last summer, for the first time, made it into a middle school. We have a summer program that we call Lemons Learners. And we had 12 middle school students who spent a week with us, and the camp was called Black History Matters. And we spent a week with them. They learned about their local history. They learned to do genealogy. They did genealogies. Most did genealogies on their own families. One student decided he didn't want to look at his family, so we gave him a name, and he researched that student. And so we are not doing that camp this summer, but we will be moving back to it. We may do it every other summer until we get some things straightened out in the state. I didn't say that. But we do have a great school of education at William & Mary. And so when I always ask the first day of class in my, how many of you are planning to be teachers? And I talk to them about their role and how important it is. And we talk about if you know anything about the lost cause and the changes that they made in the ending story of the Civil War, the main weapon, from my point of view anyway, was textbooks. They rewrote the story, as I said briefly, they rewrote the story of the end of the war and the causes of the war. And people still to this day believe that because their parents and grandparents believed it and their teachers believed it. And so that's part of the story we have to help rewrite, I think, all of us. And that's something we're definitely trying to do at William & Mary.
You bet, you bet. Now, what do you do then, taking that last important statement, how do you deal, Jody, with the extraordinary, highly polarized, conversation and action around textbooks and today in public schools? It's happening in a number of states with really sobering and frightening possibilities and impact. How do you think about that? Tell us what we should do. Tell us what we should do.
Wow, we need to start writing textbooks. We had an incident a few years back, and I won't remember all the exact details of it, but I want to say it was a Virginia history fourth or fifth grade textbook. And one of the faculty members in the history department had a child using that book. And it talked about all of the Black, formerly enslaved and enslaved people who happily fought on the side of the Confederacy. And so they had messed with the wrong people. And so, and there were many stories about it. To my knowledge, that book is not being used any longer. And that idea that these men would sign up to fight on the side of the South. And what was discovered is the author of the book admitted that her main source had been the Sons of Confederate Veterans website. You know, so those are the kinds of things we have to pay attention to, because not every child is going to have a mother or a father who's a historian, right? And so we all have to look out. We have to look out for them in our own ways.
So we're going to open up the questions. I want to ask one last question of each of the committee members, and I want to preface it by just this comment. So, in preparation for the 50th anniversary of the slaying of Dr. King, of Martin Luther King, in 2018, a very interesting family and their production company named the Coontards, they're white, made a film called King in the Wilderness. It's a documentary. If you haven't seen it, do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Go watch this. It's about King between 1966 or 65 and 1968, and the extraordinary both burden he carried in terms of being the leader of the civil rights movement, but also the absolute calling he felt to connect the quest for civil rights action, meaningful action, to economic justice and to pacifism against the war in Vietnam. It's extraordinary, but it's really a personal account of how hard it was to be Dr. Martin Luther King in 1965 and 66 and 67. It's an amazing film, all told through the eyes of people who knew him, all of his brothers and sisters in arms, most of them, but not all, Black. So I want to ask you, springboarding off that, what gives you moments of credible hope, and what makes you say, this is so hard, the story is so bad, there's still so much of what Douglas would call the slave power and the hatred that animated it. Tell us each of you, please tell us about both those aspects of the important work you do, because it's for all of us.
I can take the latter part first. The thing that is always kind of lingering in the back of my mind is, you know, this is an incredibly difficult situation. Is you know, learning new things about events like at North Carolina A&T, right? They made a jump to become a high research activity producing institution in 2004. They weren't given any additional money to make that jump, but when two predominantly white institutions did the same thing a couple of years later, they got $10 million apiece from the state of North Carolina. North Carolina A&T went back to the legislature to say, hey, you know, we would like that money as well. And they've been able to get $2.5 million of those dollars to this point. So things like that, knowing that the kind of discrimination is sort of the momentum that it has is difficult. But things like this are things that kind of give me hope, right? Things that knowing that institutions are really thinking deeply about their legacies of discrimination, are beginning to invest resources in addressing those legacies, and are thinking broadly, not just with the institution itself, but also peripheral institutions, thinking about HBCUs and tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, community colleges, right? Thinking more broadly about the atmosphere, the higher education infrastructure, as opposed to just the institution's perseverance.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Jody?
I think you asked about what gives us hope.
Yeah, well, actually, both. What bends your shoulders down on, cold nights as you walk home, or just sit having, a cup of coffee, and what also, tightens your core and says, let's go.
Well, honestly, I think what sometimes, as you say, bends my shoulders down is watching the news. And just hearing some of the things that, again, people truly believe, and it feels, and there's always a backlash. So you feel your positive steps are being taken, And then now, now we're in the midst of a backlash, right? We're in a time when people feel that they are being left out. There have white males who believe that they are now, being discriminated against, and folks who don't want to or don't have the wherewithal to understand the greater picture. So those things, I think, cause my shoulders to, because it feels like if we're going to always have backlashes, then when will this stop? Because if so if that's the pattern, but again, I think like Adam said, I think being here, knowing that this movement that started at Brown under Dr. Simmons has become a movement. Yeah. Now the organization is Universities Studying Slavery, but when it first started, we were Virginia colleges and universities studying slavery. And there were, a few of us, and then I think Georgetown was the first non-Virginia school to ask. And so now we're universities studying slavery. There are almost 100 institutions, not only in this country, but in the UK. And so that gives me hope, because again, I think going back to what I said before, colleges and universities are responsible, and they're responsible for telling the truth. You can't educate when you're living a big lie, and so telling the truth is the key. And so I think that this gathering and gatherings that will be happening all over the world give me hope.
Good. Ms. Kemi.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that gives me hope first is despite all of the hardships and challenges that students brought to the table, many of them also had stories of how they were able to find spaces here at Harvard where they truly felt at home, where they truly felt accepted and supported. And so I think that potential is there for this university to be that space, but also for this university to contribute to those spaces outside. I think what really stuck with me most is that idea of the safety net being yanked out from under you, right? This all being very fragile and temporary. So really thinking ahead, for me, it's a question of what can Harvard do, not just to sustain students for 4 years while they're here and finding those safety nets and spaces, but in actually making those deeper changes in society so that students have access to that both before and after they get their degrees here. And I think that brings me to the challenging part of all this, which is that, that's a big ask. That's a lot of work that needs to happen. It's a lot of work that needs to happen on multiple different levels, and it is going to be incredibly slow. The students brought so much energy to these interviews, and a lot of them, when they followed up at the end, said, oh, hey, are you going to be able to send us something about this, or what are you going to do with this? And when we explained that this project was likely going to take several years, even just to have things published on it, they were kind of like, then what is even the point of telling you my story? I'm going to be graduated, right? But really making sure that we're looking toward sort of the urgency and the immediacy of what students need now, but also really thinking about these long-term, deep structural changes that need to happen and that Harvard as an institution can have an important role in.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to take some questions now from wherever they came from. I don't know here, but they're on Slido. So let me start with someone who asked the question almost as soon as you started speaking, Adam. This person asked, can you, and any of you comment, please. But I'll start with Adam because it was directed as Adam was speaking. Can you comment on student loan forgiveness and how you see that in the context of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, I think we have constructed a system that where effectively states spend, was it $5 billion less a year educating black students than they do white students, and there are a couple of reasons why that is. The institutions that black students are more likely to attend, including community colleges, public regional institutions, have fewer resources to spend on those students, so they ultimately end up taking out more loans. We also know that it's true that black students are more likely to take out student debt, more likely to take out more student debt, more likely to default on that debt, whether they finish with a degree or without a degree. And so I think that the arguments that, suggest that, maybe this isn't a sort of, progressive policy, maybe this isn't something that is, will help close the racial wealth gap. Right? I think that those arguments should be taken seriously. But I also believe that, and the data bears out that there is that the student debt issue is one that is unevenly felt.
Yeah.
And so in that situation, with the knowledge that we have of who is defaulting on student debt, who is being most affected, and who is being seriously affected by the student debt, I think that it is a conversation that as we think more expansively about addressing critical issues in higher education, whether that is, the cost of college, which is a big one for a lot of people. I think that debt cancellation is a central piece of that, knowing, historically, the institutions got more expensive as more Black people started attending and as they grew more diverse.
Jody or Kevin, do you want to comment? You don't have to, but.
I certainly think it should happen. I think students who are graduating with mortgage-sized loan payments are going to be in very serious trouble, and therefore the entire country is going to be in very serious trouble. So I agree that it needs to happen, and there needs to be a way that more grants and scholarships are provided to students so they don't have to go into debt to get an education.
Yeah, and Harvard was one of the universities that led sort of the no loans financial aid policy here for undergraduates, and that makes a huge difference for students. And there's now a lot of work being done to better support first-gen and low-income students during their experiences here. And so I think that makes a big difference as well. But I think also this is a moment to think expansively, not just about how to cancel student debt, but how to sort of rethink who even has to pay for the privilege of having an education. The University of California, for example, just announced that enrolled members of federally recognized tribes will no longer have to pay tuition due to California's history of genocide against Native peoples. And so I wonder, so I wonder if we think expansively, how else could we tackle this problem of debt?
Let me follow your comments on the question directed just to you that's coming recently. For Kemi, what possibilities for solidarity are there between the Harvard Legacy of Slavery Initiative and Native people's efforts for recognition and redress? Do you want to comment on that? Or either of you as well?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And I think there are definitely opportunities for folks to work together, but I think that part of it is that we're seeing two communities here who have been made invisible, who have been under-resourced, who have been sort of pushed to the side for so long that oftentimes we're just so wrapped up in trying to get our own stories told and to get our own stories out there, that saps all of our energy. And so I think one thing that could definitely be done is more sort of support or space on the institutional end to create those spaces where Black and Native people can come together and build that solidarity and have that time to just be with one another and not have to be fighting for just that basic recognition all of the time.
Miss Jody, this is for you. Can you expound on the listening sessions and outreach? And maybe Kemi, you want to speak as well, but Jody, can you expound on the listening sessions and outreach you did at the beginning of the project and how you built participation and trust and what the impact of those sessions have been in the Lemon Project? Someone also asked, by the way, why is it called the Lemon Project? So if you can give us a super on this, that would be great.
Yeah, we got those questions a lot in the beginning. I'll start with that one. Lemon was a man who was enslaved by William and Mary. And there was a list that a doctoral candidate found of 21 enslaved people. And the top part of the list listed the names and then kind of their health status, and the bottom listed enslaved people who were possibly eligible to be hired out. And Lemon was on that list. And at the time, when it came time to name the project, we knew the most about him as an individual. We knew that he sometimes grew produce and sold it to the college. We knew that he among a few others, received what they called a Christmas bonus one year. Around 1815, they bought him medicine, and in 1817, they bought his coffin. And so it's still a very pitiable amount of information to know about a human being, but he still is the individual we know the most about. But of course, he represents everyone known and unknown at the college. So that's how we got the name, the Lemon Project. In terms of the listening sessions and the symposia, because in the beginning, a lot of our panels consisted of individuals from the community, and they talked about, and we back up and they'll say we started by meeting in the what is the Bruton Heights School, and it was the K through 12 segregated school for in Williamsburg. And it was a central part of that community, and that Colonial Williamsburg purchased it many years ago and was considering tearing it down and making a parking lot. And the Black community came together, the alums came together before we were ever involved, and they saved the school. And it became a space of still owned by Colonial Williamsburg, but with access of the alums, and so we chose to have our first 3 symposia there because that was, again, it was the center of the community. And so people came, they participated on panels, they participated in small group discussions, and we talked to them and we asked them questions, and they talked to us. And I think
were they glad to tell their stories?
They were glad to tell their story. Most people were glad to tell their stories. But in some were certainly skeptically looking at William and Mary. And one, I'll tell you, when the Lemon Project was announced, and this was before we actually started working, there was a man in the community who stood up and he said, "Okay, William and Mary, we'll be watching you." and that's always stuck in my mind, because the original call was this would be an 8-year archival research project. And that comment, and then just talking to the other people, we knew very early on that we could not go into the archives for 8 years and come out, even if we came out with a Pulitzer Prize winning book, that we had to be in the community and in the archives at the same time. And so getting back in terms of how we spent that time, again, meeting with the community. We had our events in the community, but eventually we outgrew them. And so but we also wanted to let people know, let Black people in the community know that William and Mary was a resource for them, that you should not live in a college town and not be able to take advantage of it. Even if your kids want to go somewhere else, there are opportunities there, and you should know that, and you should be comfortable. And so after a few years, we did start having events and the symposium on campus. And I'm happy to say that the community is still our largest constituency at these events. And I think in terms of building, how the trust was built, was just going there, visiting, participating in activities, serving on community-based committees, and just being a part and not, and talking with them and not at them, and asking them what they wanted, what can we, what kinds of things do you need? And it took, and again, as I said, we've been doing this since 2010, although the beginnings were 2007 with the student resolution. But we just spend time, and now I will also tell you that the genealogy initiative has really opened doors. And just recently, the postdoc and I were in a meeting with some people from the community. They're going to be doing a project on a African-American cemetery. And this woman who's been in the community who grew up there, she said to us, people love the Lemon Project. They love you, and they love our postdoc, you know, because he's out there, and they, again, as I was saying earlier, they wanted to know, people want to know how to do their genealogy. And so he's not doing it at the individual genealogies, but we're setting up workshops, and he's guiding them, and he's bringing in outside speakers, and it's really, you know, it's really, I think, certainly carried us even further in terms of what the people in the community think about the Lemon Project and about William and Mary.
We are out of time. Thank you very much, Jody. On many levels, thank you all very much. On many levels. We're out of time, but I just want to mention, thinking broadly about these extraordinary experts and change makers, each of them, and this larger effort of which we're privileged to be a part. I was just reminded as you were speaking, Jody, of the Highlander School, which was it was an extraordinary institution that never would have said we're here to talk about the legacy of slavery. It wasn't framed that way, but the efforts of the Highlander School, which became a breeding ground for all kinds of men and women that were involved in the Civil Rights Project, and for many, many other people, right, that needed to tell the truth, wanted to know the truth about all this. Here we are at a very important moment with an extraordinary group of people. And thank you for the blessings of being able to hear your expertise and thoughtfulness and integrity in this small slice. So thank you very much.